Hello, I'm Josef, and I'm gonna talk about a joint work with Adrian Dumitrescu. The title of the paper is Piercing All Translates of a Set of Axis Parallel Rectangles. But first, I would actually like to start with a puzzle. So here it is. So imagine you play a game of Battleship where an opponent has a 3x2 ship, a rectangle with width 3 and height 2, hidden somewhere inside an n by n square board. The question is, how many cells do you need to shoot at to be sure that you hit the ship at least once? So if you want to think about the puzzle, think about it, and you can pause the video and I will continue talking. So as an example, this shooting arrangement is not valid because there are still copies of the places where the ship could be and where it would not be hit. So if you think about it, you'll probably find out that there is an arrangement of shots that hits roughly every sixth cell and that has the property that it hits the 3x2 ship no matter where it is placed. There is even a little bit of freedom of how we, where exactly we shoot. So roughly 1/6 of the shots would suffice. And indeed, one can also see that 1/6 of the shots are necessary because most of the board can be tiled by 3x2 rectangles, and each such tile requires to be hit at least once. So this was actually a simple puzzle. It was not the actual puzzle. So the actual puzzle is, what if you do not know whether the ship is placed horizontally as a 3x2 or vertically as a 2x3? So how many shots would you need now? So that's the actual puzzle. So again, you can pause the video and I'll continue talking. So this time, the initial arrangement will not work because even though it does hit all the horizontal ships, it might miss some of the vertical ships, or it does miss some of the vertical ships. What you can do is you can use a denser arrangement that hits roughly every fifth cell, and that does have the property that it pierces all the ships, both the horizontal ones and the vertical ones. But 1/5 is more than 1/6, so the question is 1/5 really needed, or could we perhaps do with fewer shots? And the answer to that is that indeed 1/5 is needed. You can't do with fewer shots. And I'll just very briefly sketch the argument. So the trick in the argument is to look at 3x3 subrectangles that I will call boxes. And you can note that some boxes will be hit in their center, in their central cell of the 9 cells they consist of. But the key observation, is that if a box is not hit in its center, then it needs to be hit at least twice. And you can check this, it's a very, very small casework. Maybe if it's hit once in the left middle cell, then there is still an empty 2x3 rectangle that needs to be hit again. And similarly for the corner. Anyway, for each box, you either hit it in the center or you have to hit it at least twice. So now with this observation in mind, the proof is actually a kind of double counting argument. So I'll just briefly go through it. So we can suppose that S should suffice. Then at most S of the boxes can be shot in their middle, in their central cell. And all the remaining boxes, of which there are n-2 squared minus S, have to be hit at least twice. And each cell that we shoot at contributes to at most 9 boxes, because simple geometry. So in the end, we get an inequality that reads like this, and upon rewriting, we obtain that S is at least 1/5 of the n-2 squared. So ignoring the lower order terms, we get that we need to hit at least every fifth cell. So 1/5 n squared, roughly, is really needed. Cool. So this is the solution to the introductory puzzle. And this, for me, will be a bridge to the problem that we actually study. So the problem we actually study is a bit different from this. And there are two differences highlighted here at the bottom of the slide. So one difference is that instead of considering rectangles inside a finite n by n board, we would like to remove the boundary conditions, so we work in the whole plane. This has a small disadvantage that we need to define density of a point set, and this now is a little bit more technical, but there is a standard way to do that using limits inferior as the density over disks that are larger and larger. So in the limit of R, the radius of it is going to infinity, how many points there are in the intersection over the area of the disk. And also another difference is that instead of using discrete translating by vectors in Z squared, we'll actually consider for all the possible translations. So in the end, what we obtain is the problem stated here above. Given a family F of rectangles and rectangles, all of them axis parallel, all of them closed, what is the lowest possible density pi of F of a point set that pierces each translate of each rectangle? Cool. So this statement might remind you of some similar problems you have seen before. So let me briefly cover at least two areas that are somewhat similar. So one broad area is, of course, piercing finite sets of rectangles. So that has been studied for decades, and there are many interesting cool results. So I'll list just a very few. So the one good, strong, interesting result already from the 80s is that the question of finding the smallest possible set for a given finite family of rectangles, the question of how many was the fewest number of points that you need to pierce each of those rectangles. So this problem is NP-hard, even if your rectangles are infinite unit squares. From the more recent side, there is an approximation, actually a log-log approximation, so a pretty good approximation, even though not a constant vector one, from 2010. This is by epsilon net. And there is also an interesting polynomial time approximation scheme if the finite family of rectangles has a property that it's fat, whatever that means. You can look up the reference. On another note, there is another broad area that is somewhat similar to what, so the differences from this setup I've just discussed to our setup is that for us, the family of rectangles is infinite. So we consider a family of templates, but then each template, we consider all the possible translations of that template. So this makes the problem different. Fine, so now for the second area, there is a thing called dispersion. So the way to think about it is that you are given a unit square, 0, 1, and you are allowed to drop endpoints inside that square. And what you would like to do is you would like to pierce all rectangles that have large area. So for example, if you are allowed to use 10 points, it's easy to pierce all the rectangles that have area 1/2 because there are just not so many of them. But then you could also pierce all the rectangles that have area 1/3. And the question of what's the lowest area that you can guarantee to pierce? So that's exactly the dispersion dn, or d of 10 or d of n, depending how many points you have. So there, it's known that the dispersion scales the dispersion is inversely proportional to the number n of points that you are allowed to drop inside the square. And very recently, there has been progress on the associated constants. So we know that the associated constants are between 1.5 and 1.9. And the difference to our setup, so how is our setup different to dispersion is that dispersion doesn't care about the shapes of the rectangles. It only cares about the area, while we do care about the shapes. So we have a few shapes and we consider all the translates. Another difference is, of course, that dispersion is operates in a bounded region, a square of size 0, 1, while we operate in the whole plane. So there is this unboundedness thing. Okay, cool. So this was just briefly covering some of the related work. So now let's go back to our problem. So first we cover some simple cases. So one simple case is when our family consists of a single rectangle. So we insist that we pierce all the translates over one fixed single rectangle. And then actually the solution is very simple, because that one rectangle will tile the plane, and we can use a lattice that corresponds to the tiling as our piercing set. And on the other hand, one can easily see that each tile has to be pierced at least once, and those two bounds match exactly. So in the end, what we obtain is that the lowest possible piercing density, this pi of f, if the set f consists of a single rectangle with width w and height h, is simply 1 over the product w times h. And this is a first hint also that actually what is sometimes more convenient is to look not at the density, but at the reciprocal of the density, so kind of the per point area. So we will denote this by capital A of f, and the future bounds will be for the capital A of f instead of for the density, because we'll, in this way, we'll avoid some fractions. Cool, so this is a simple case, and actually it is also a good point to make a short detour. So let me just state, without going to details of the proofs, that in case our family F consists of a single shape, and it could be any shape, not necessarily a rectangle, then the problem of determining the minimum piercing density is in fact equivalent to the classical problem of determining the minimum translative covering density for theta t of the same shape as. So the proof is here below. It's just from the definition. It turns out to be that the two problems are equivalent. I think that's interesting, but unfortunately it does not really help us in solving our problem, because it turns out that this problem of determining the translative covering density is only known for solved for shapes that either tile the plane or for a very few other shapes, such as disks or regular n-coins. But it's a nice connection anyway. Okay, but this was just a detour that I wanted to briefly mention. So let's go back to our problem, to the next simplest case, which is if our family F does not consist of a single rectangle, but of two rectangles. So the first observation here is that without loss of generality, we can assume that the narrower of the two rectangles has width 1, and the shorter of the two triangles has height 1. So this is just because any piercing points that can be stretched along the x-axis and along the y-axis, such that all the rectangles stretch accordingly. So now the simpler case is if after this stretching, one of the rectangles is much bigger than the other one. So here I drew two rectangles. One is wide and the other one is kind of tall, but not so tall. And what we can do in that case is that we construct a lattice that barely pierces all the copies of the not so tall rectangle. And then what turns out is that we get to pierce all the copies of the wide rectangle for free, because it's just so wide that no matter where we place it, it will hit one of the marks, one of the points that we use to hit the tall rectangle. And again, this is just a very brief sketch. You would have to think about it, I guess, but this is just an idea. So what this leaves us with is the case when, upon the rescaling, what we get is two rectangles that are where one has the width that is roughly the same as the height of the other one. And here, roughly the same turns out to mean that the floors, like integer floors of those two numbers, turn out to be the same. So what we still need to, the cases we still need to cover are when the width can be expressed as some integer k plus x, where x is between 0 and 1. And the height of the other rectangle can be expressed as the same k plus integer k plus some leftover y, again, in the interval from 0 to 1. And what we can show in that case, and this arguably is our main theorem, or one of our two main results, is that there is an upper bound and there is a lower bound on this per point area. The lower bound, that's not that interesting. It's just some examples of lattices that happen to pierce both those rectangles simultaneously. But the interesting part is the upper bound. So I would like to briefly talk about the upper bound. So how we proceed to show that? Well, it's similar to what we did in the actual puzzle, if you still remember. So instead of looking at a 3x3 box, we look at a box that has a size k plus x times k plus y. So it's shown here on the left. So the width matches the width of the wide rectangle, and the height matches the height of the tall rectangle. And then we defined a subregion of that box that we call a zone. Now here in the right figure, it's shaded in yellow. And it consists of k squared subrectangles, and the dimensions are as specified in the right panel. And the key thing is that we can show that the box either contains k shots, all of them inside the zone, or otherwise it must contain at least k plus 1 shots. So this hopefully resembles on some level the argument that we saw for the discrete version with 2x3 and 3x2 chips. So let me now try to convince you that this claim is true. So let's say we look at the box and we find a shot that lies outside of the zone. So maybe it lies here. Well, then we can still partition the leftover part of the box, or we can find 3 interior disjoint tall rectangles inside the box. And each of them has to be pierced. So together with the one shot that was lying outside of the zone, we still require k more shots. So in total, k plus 1 shots. And similarly, if the first shot was here in this small region, then we can find k more horizontal rectangles. So in any case, if there is a shot inside the box that does not fall into the zone, that kind of does not help us at all. We still require at least k more shots inside that box. Well, and now, given that this is true, how we proceed is essentially analogous to what we did in the puzzle. We somehow average over all the possible boxes and we do some algebra. The algebra is now a bit more technical because there are integrals instead of just discrete double counting, but it can be done. And there is also some smart bounds, but I mean, this is the main gist of the argument. Cool. So let me move on. So to summarize our results for the two rectangles, so we have a matching upper bound and a lower bound in a good proportion of cases. So this is the left panel. So on the x-axis, we have the width w. On the y-axis, we have the height h. And on the vertical axis, we show this pair point area of when this family F consists of two rectangles rescaled, as we always do. And then whatever is shown is in orange, this is where our bounds match exactly. And where they don't match, there we show the lower bound in blue. So you can see that if the floors of the W and H are different, then we know exactly. If both the floors are equal to 1, then we also know exactly. That's because the upper bound and the lower bound from the previous theorem actually match. So what we do not know is when both the floor of W and the floor of H are equal to some integer, but that integer is at least 2. And in that case, we have lower bound shown in blue on the right and upper bound shown in red that are still pretty tight, pretty close to each other. So all in all, one consequence of this is that we have a very good approximation. So if we consider the problem where on the input we are given a family of two rectangles, then we can answer what's this optimal piercing density, was the sparsest possible set that pierces all the translates of both those two rectangles. Not exactly, but within a ratio of 1.086 or something. So this is our first algorithmic result. But I will stress it only applies to the case when the family consists of two rectangles. So what happens when the family consists of n rectangles? Well, that's our second result. And there we get again, an approximation. The constant factor approximation, the constant is a bit worse. It's this 1.895, which might look familiar to you because it appears in some related results on dispersion. But still, it's a constant factor approximation. So I'll just very, very briefly sketch, again, the idea behind the proof of this constant factor approximation. So this is the crux. The claim is that if we take a lattice with bases 1, phi, and phi minus 1, where phi is the golden ratio, then this lattice will pierce all the rectangles that have area phi to the 4th power or more. And maybe that's surprising when you first hear it, but when you actually draw the lattice and look at all the maximal boxes that you can draw in the lattice, it quickly turns out that they have some properties. They are like essentially phi to some power and phi to 4 minus that power. And this is a claim that can be proved by induction, and once it is proved by induction, it means that we can take this lattice and scale it down such that this area phi to the 4th power instead becomes the area of the smallest rectangle in our family. And this is a lattice that attests that we have this constant approximation. The factor turns out to be this phi to the 4th power over phi squared plus 1, or in other words, this expression here, or in other words, roughly 1.9. Cool. So this was very brief, but if you want to see more, I'll be happy if you have a look at the paper, and I'll be happy if you show up at the conference and to hear the short talk and ask some questions. So let me conclude by 2 slides with some possible directions for future research. So one more specific slide is this one about the loose ends of our work. So of course, one outstanding question is, what is actually the piercing density for the case of 2 rectangles when the 2 rectangles have the dimensions that have the same floor and the floor is an integer, which is at least 1. So in other words, the only cases which we could not resolve exactly for the regime of 2 rectangles. Now, for the regime of n rectangles, we really don't quite know. So we present this constant approximation, but as far as we could tell, it could even be that there is a polynomial time approximation scheme, or at least there is a better constant approximation. On the other hand, we really could not tell. Maybe it's just hard, and maybe there is no polynomial time approximation scheme. So there is much to explore. And then, even more generally, so all of this work was focusing on 2 dimensions. So an obvious question is what happens in the higher dimensions, and this is largely unexplored. Some results from the dispersion world might be helpful in some regards, but it will not be easy. At least that's what we think. And another assumption that we made is that we only consider translations. Of course, one can ask what happens if you consider rigid motions instead of translations. And this was only, we are aware of essentially only one paper that does something like that. And this would be the result. The third question is, we considered only axis parallel rectangles. What happens if you consider more complicated shapes? Presumably the problems become hard. So can you prove hardness of that problem? And what is the simplest possible family of shapes for which you can prove hardness? So many questions remain. Okay, and with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. And yeah, I hope to see you at the conference. Thank you.